Difficult video games. Everybody loves them, right? Well, maybe not, but they do have their appeal. I mean, just look at how popular the Dark Souls games are. In fact, I'd argue that Dark Souls repopularized the difficult video game. However, back in the day, difficult video games were practically a dime a dozen, and a game presenting a challenge was expected. So why were so many games difficult back then? Well, if you look at the early roots of video games, there's no arguing that the arcades didn't play a huge role. And arcades were designed to make money. Makes sense, I mean, you'd always find them in a business of some kind. They were designed to be fun, but not so you could just plow through the entire game without having to put in more quarters. When you jump over to the console side of things, games were difficult for a different reason. People had to pay a lot of money up front for these games, and if they could just beat the game within the first hour or two of playing, they would feel ripped off. Now, higher difficulty was an easy thing to get away with at the time because it was just a common aspect of video games' identity. The NES era is known for having some pretty difficult games. The 16-bit generation had some difficult games as well, though isn't quite as notorious. And it wasn't until video games started to go more mainstream in the home console market that the difficulty spike really went down. I mean, it makes sense that people would want to actually complete their games, and technology had advanced enough that games could be made longer in order to compensate for more rapid progression. Gaming had been moving away from the arcade design philosophy to incorporate more games that had exploration, puzzle solving, and other time-consuming tasks. However, with these elements came a different kind of difficulty. And it's a certain kind of difficulty that I like to call the what the hell do I do difficulty, or the where the hell do I go difficulty. Whereas with games before, it would generally be clear what you needed to do, but the act of actually doing it is what was difficult. This is where good old strategy guides come into play. Or yeah, it's 2019, just look it up online. I personally try to avoid guides, but there's actually some cases where I think it makes the game more enjoyable to have it. The original Donkey Kong Country is a good example. It's almost necessary for some of the secrets in that game. Like, how was I supposed to find that? Not only that, but sometimes as adults, we just don't have the time to go looking for this stuff. Like, I gotta be somewhere important in 20 minutes, but I'll be damned if I don't find this gosh danged Jiggy before I leave. So, in those cases, having some help can make our gaming time more efficient. Now, I've heard people say that using help is cheating, but what are we talking about here, taxes? These are video games, and it's all about doing whatever optimizes your enjoyment as far as I'm concerned. If you beat a game without a guide, then it's a greater challenge, sure, but let's not act like people are doing something bad if they use help. How challenging you like your games will vary by gamer, and will often influence which games you choose to play. For the games that require being able to properly manipulate your character, there's really not much you can do to curb the difficulty. If you want to beat a game like Ghouls and Ghosts, you just have to be good at the game. There's no getting around it. So why would gamers want to play something that is more difficult? Do they like banging their head against a wall? Well, the most obvious answer is that there's a huge sense of accomplishment in beating something difficult. And in these cases, satisfying progression works in a different way. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Okay, so if you're breezing through an easy game, then you're moving through the levels pretty quickly without having to replay much of the game due to deaths. However, if you're dying a lot and having to restart at the beginning of a stage or checkpoint, the progression comes from getting a little bit farther each time, learning something new, whether it be an enemy's weakness, or a helpful strategy as you're figuring out how to beat a boss battle. If you're just dying the exact same way, at the exact same spot over and over, then yeah, it's going to be difficult to find enjoyment in that, and that's usually when people will write off a game as not for them, or just call it a bad game if they're feeling especially salty about it. One of the most brutal aspects of older games that can be a rude awakening for people used to newer games is the limited number of continues, and how that can lead to you getting sent all the way back to the beginning of the game. For those games, the challenge lies in trying to get a little bit farther each time until you can eventually beat the entire game. Luckily, some games did have unlimited continues, and especially in the NES era. I've actually beaten some of these NES games, as well as some of the difficult 16-bit era games. And the thing I always go back to is that nobody really cares, you know? Certainly nobody outside of the gaming world cares. It ultimately just comes down to enjoyment and whether the challenge enhances that for you or not. And that leads to this week's question, which is how difficult do you like your video games? And what's the most difficult game you've ever beaten? Let us know in the comments, and I will see ya in the next video.